second row. These four surfaces form two joints. One, a proximal, the wrist joint proper, and two, a distal, the mid-carpal joint. 1. The wrist joint proper is a true condyloid articulation and therefore all movements but rotation are permitted. Flexion and extension are the most free, and of these a greater amount of extension than of flexion is permitted, since the articulating surfaces extend farther on the dorsal than on the volar surfaces of the carpal bones. In this movement, the carpal bones rotate on a transverse axis drawn between the tips of the styloid processes of the radius and ulna. A certain amount of adduction or ulnar flexion and abduction or radial flexion is also permitted. The former is considerably greater in extent than the latter on account of the shortness of the styloid process of the ulna, abduction being soon limited by the contact of the styloid process of the radius with the greater multangular. In this movement, the carpus revolves upon an antero-posterior axis drawn through the center of the wrist. Footnote: H. M. Johnston, Journal of Anatomy and Physiology, Volume 41, maintains that ulnar and radial flexion, only slight lateral movement occurs at the radiocarpal joint, and that in complete flexion and extension of the hand there is a small degree of ulnar flexion at the radiocarpal joint. End footnote. Finally, circumduction is permitted by the combined and consecutive movements of adduction, extension, abduction, and flexion. No rotation is possible, but the effect of rotation is obtained by the pronation and supination of the radius on the ulna. The movement of flexion is performed by the flexor carpi radialis, the flexor carpi ulnaris, and the palmaris longus. Extension by the extensors carpi radialis longus and brevis and the extensor carpi ulnaris. Adduction, ulnar flexion by the flexor carpi ulnaris and the extensor carpi ulnaris. Abduction, radial flexion by the abductor pollicis longus, the extensors of the thumb, and the extensors carpi radialis longus and brevis, and the flexor carpi radialis. When the fingers are extended, flexion of the wrist is performed by the flexor carpi radialis and ulnaris, and extension is aided by the extensor digitorum communis. When the fingers are flexed, flexion of the wrist is aided by the flexors digitorum sublimis and profundus, and extension is performed by the extensors carpi radialis and ulnaris. Number 2. The chief movements permitted in the mid-carpal joint are flexion and extension and a slight amount of rotation. In the flexion and extension, which are the movements most freely enjoyed, the greater and lesser multangulars on the radial side and the hamate on the ulnar side glide forward and backward on the navicular and triangular respectively, while the head of the capitate and the superior surface of the hamate rotate in the cup-shaped cavity of the navicular and lunate. Flexion at this joint is freer than extension. A very trifling amount of rotation is also permitted, the head of the capitate rotating around a vertical axis drawn through its own center, while at the same time a slight gliding movement takes place in the lateral and medial portions of the joint. End of section 14.